Hello, I am Lisa McDonald, one of the service charge consultants here at Esse, and today I am going to be talking to you about the new legislation on heat networks, the possible impact of these regulations on service charges, and some of the considerations around the two current consultations which end on the 31st of January 2025. There is expected to be a lot more guidance coming out along with further micro consultations, one example being on the Heat Network's Technical Assurance Scheme, which will cover metering and billing, and the proposal of a 5-year transition for individual meter installation where supported and sheltered housing are no longer thought to be exempt. Only HMOs, that is a house in multiple occupation, are currently not falling under the scope of the new legislation. Another consultation that is expected is on fair pricing. Firstly, we will start with some context. So Ofgem were appointed as the regulator of heat networks in the Energy Act 2023 and have recently implemented two consultations on the back of this, one being implementing consumer protections, which is a joint consultation with the Department of Energy Security, and secondly, an Ofgem-only consultation on authorisation and regulatory oversight. This regulation will cover both England and Wales, plus Scotland, which was part of the Heat Network Scotland Act 2021. If we look at what the regulation will cover, this will fall into three categories: entry into the heat network market, ongoing regulatory activities, and finally, what happens if something goes wrong. The approach to consulting on the heat network's regulatory framework is broken down into three policy areas, the first being consumer protection, which is the two current consultations, the second being heat network zoning, which is supposed to identify and designate zones where heat networks provide the lowest low-carbon heating option, and it isn't clear if the Welsh Government have opted out of this, so we are waiting on confirmation on this. And finally, technical and performance standards, where there is expected to be differences for newer and existing schemes, but there will of course be an absolute minimum standard. This slide is just a high-level timeline of the commencements of the regulation in January 2026 to the deadline 1 year on in January 2027, where operators and suppliers should have registered with Ofgem and provided all the relevant information on their heat networks. But just starting off with the two consultations we are discussing in this presentation, these were published in November 2024 and closed on the 31st of January 2025. We are then looking at April 2025 when the consumer advocacy and redress schemes commence, and that's when consumer advice, the likes of Consumer Scotland and Citizens Advice Bureau in England, will come into operation. January 2026 is the commencement when the conditions come into effect for heat networks for both operators and suppliers. The current proposals at the moment state if you are currently operating as a heat network, your path will be a bit different than if you are going to be developing a new heat network, in that currently operating heat networks will automatically be authorised, and there will be a time being referred to as the initial period where you have to register your heat networks via the online digital tool and provide information around a named person who is responsible for the heat networks, the location of the heat energy centres, the number of consumers you have and the types of consumers, with the deadline being January 2027. This is so that there isn't an immediate January 2026 obligation where everything kicks off and it is more of a phased approach. Just to note, if registration is delayed to the latter end of 2026, it is understood backdated reporting will still be expected, so earlier registration is advisable to familiarise yourself with the necessary reporting requirements. January 2027 onwards, it is understood all heat networks are registered and authorised, so ongoing review of market trends and reactions will now be the focus, and authorisation by application commencing of any new heat networks. It is recognised that heat networks provide an essential service to customers, and Ofgem want to ensure that customers stay on a supply where their operator may fail. However, Ofgem have recognised that the housing sector is already subject to considerable regulation in both financial monitoring and in terms of service provision, and there are in fact already arrangements in place to manage failure if it did occur, either with another provider stepping in or through a special administration regime. Although there are varying operating methods between the three nations, it is felt that all provide a backstop to mitigate any risk, along with legislation supporting the continued supply of heating and hot water. What this means is Ofgem are proposing to take a segmented approach to stepping requirements regarding financial resilience and reporting, and if the authorised provider is subject to the social housing regimes in Scotland, England or Wales, they will not be subject to the heat network requirements. So in the event of insolvency, the social housing stepping process, which includes a special administration regime as a backstop, would take precedence of the heat network stepping process. This is also understood to apply to local authorities. One of the main drivers for this regulation is due to the natural monopoly and lack of consumer choice. Both consultations should be read in conjunction with each other, but Ofgem have been hoping feedback would come from operators, suppliers, developers, domestic and non-domestic, and small and medium enterprises of heat networks, along with specialists in this policy area who are feeding back on behalf of the sector as a whole. The Ofgem owner consultation regarding authorisation and regulatory oversight relates to the regulatory activities and processes which will underpin the regulatory framework which will be most relevant to heat network operators and suppliers, metering and billing agents, large or small heat network entities, not-for-profits, and entities for profit. The key areas being the scope of authorisation, including who and what activities will be regulated, and the registration and authorisation application processes. Outline of the monitoring regime, including the level of detail and frequency of data which will need to be reported. Ofgem's planned approach to audit, including implementation timelines and proportionality in their sampling approach. And finally, the range of compliance approaches, including where will Ofgem focus compliance during the introduction of the regulatory framework. If we look at the approach to this regulatory oversight, Ofgem plan to take a risk-based approach to this and will primarily be using a digital tool to allow heat networks to provide regular monitoring data in the hope that this will help them identify any issues, but they will also rely on data from consumer advice bodies such as Citizens Advice. There is an understanding that heat networks will need time to adapt to the introduction of this regulation, so there will be lots of micro consultations and guidance as part of this implementation. Ofgem are proposing to collect regular data from heat networks on an array of areas, including vulnerability, pricing, complaints and disconnections, metering data and stepping arrangements. In some cases, this could be via declarations, or in most cases, this is likely to be data provided to Ofgem via the digital tool. The level of information required may vary depending on the type and size of organisation. Ofgem will also be introducing an audit programme which will provide assurance and confirm compliance with obligations, and the proposal is that these audits will cover the authorised entity rather than be site specific, as certain policies and processes will apply across multiple sites. So as an housing association operating multiple heat networks, responsibility for this will apply to the operating entity rather than an audit for each individual network, although if there is a potential risk identified, then an audit may be required which is site specific. Underpinned by a high level principle that authorised parties should be open and cooperative with the regulator and abide by the broad conduct principles, authorisation conditions that heat networks are required to meet, which is to take action to mitigate risks of not meeting a condition or other requirement, and that activities are conducted in such a way that can reasonably lead to compliance. Compliance actions will be based on risks identified through self-reporting, data intelligence and audits, and Ofgem are expected to take account of the diverse range of heat networks in the market when considering any compliance. Enforcement can be used where there are areas of significant consumer detriment and poor conduct leading to a potential breach of rules. There are a number of enforcement tools available, including investigations, orders and ability to impose penalties, and there is also a consideration being given around fixed penalties, and further details will be included in enforcement guidelines and penalty notice guidance. The joint Ofgem and DESNZ consultation, which I will focus on more so, is the consumer protection proposals. It's a very long consultation with high-level proposals. This slide sets out key objectives, which I won't read through, but as you can see are listed. The high-level consumer protection objectives are to ensure customers receive clear and accurate information about the terms of their supply so they can understand what they are paying for and what they are likely to pay in the future, have recourse to a complaint handling process, including access to an independent redress scheme to escalate complaints, receive a fair price supported by a data-based framework which enables Ofgem to identify and take action against disproportionate pricing, and receive a reliable supply of heat backed up where appropriate by a compensation regime if they experience interruptions. For those who will now be regulated, Ofgem are splitting legal entity into two groups, suppliers and operators, who have different obligations depending on what activities they are undertaking. Supplier obligations will relate to billing, complaints, consumer vulnerability, debt support and standards of conduct, whereas operator obligations will include the new technical standards compliance and guaranteed standards of performance. Housing associations in many cases will be both the supplier and the operator, but an example of where this may not be the case is where a managed agent may be the operator and they will bill the housing association, who then in turn service charge their customers. This would make the housing association the supplier. The standards of conduct listed in this slide, all with the need of underlying data and reporting requirements, are a set of outcome-focused principles underpinned by the objectives of treating consumers fairly regarding supplier behaviour to ensure consumers have a positive experience, the provision of information and that it should be timely, accessible, clear, complete, tailored to the customer and accurate in reflecting the relevant content, the delivery of good customer service and that it is effective and easy for all consumers to access, identifying vulnerable consumers and have a specific regard to their circumstances in designing processes, and finally customer engagement, a feedback mechanism which enables adequate consumer engagement and is accessible to all. I am not going to go into detail about fair pricing because further consultation is to be provided on this element aimed at affordability of consumers, but whilst considering procurement of gas contracts and cost efficiency of the network. Although the regulations are recognised as being needed, many housing associations are dealing with a legacy of poorly developed and commissioned systems that won't deliver on their promise without investment, so where does that funding come from to support this? Discussion around pay-as-you-go meters as part of this consultation would be beneficial to understand Ofgem's stance due to often higher tariffs, but for landlords, they are cheaper to administer than credit meters, actually help customers' budgets so are more viable, and also reduce any corporate debt risk. Although there is provision in the energy bill for price caps to be applied to heat networks, it is extremely unlikely this will happen. What is more likely is that there will be benchmarking to look at standing charges and how they can possibly align with domestic billing. Billing and transparency communication, regardless of whether heat networks remain as part of the service charges or not, will be mandated. Please see the slide for what is the current proposals. I won't read them all out, but as you can see, there's a lot of information that will now need to be provided. So things like information on how heat networks contribute to net zero targets, contact information on the availability of consumer advocacy from Citizens Advice or Consumer Scotland, information on support mechanisms offered by supplier and fuel poverty charities, and so on. Another big debate is over compensation payouts, with significant pushback from consumer advocacy groups that the sector should not be excluded from having to pay. This slide details the compensation levels for domestic customers. However, it is recognised that social landlords are a not-for-profit sector and would struggle to pay out these amounts. So there is a proposal for an overall performance standard to be adopted without a compensation mechanism, and that housing associations would instead have to submit a performance improvement plan to Ofgem. Ultimately, poor performance could lead to the housing association being reported to the housing regulator, which in turn could affect their ratings. Another aspect needing more consideration by Ofgem, and which is being fed back as part of the consultation, is the impact on housing associations in Wales. With the Renting Homes Wales Act 2016, under the Fitness for Human Habitation, if there was no heating supply, the customer could withhold their rent, which is a form of compensation. Although in England, customers cannot withhold their rent in the same way, there is still a duty under the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985 as a landlord for Fitness for Human Habitation, so this all needs more thought around compensation. It could also get really confusing for housing associations dealing with complaints. Which legislation does the complaint fall under? Is it the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985 or is it the Heat Networks Regulation, for example? Part of the consultation on what the housing sector has been asked to consider is the unbundling of heat charges from service charges. The reason Ofgem want heating charges to be unbundled from service charges is that they do not want anyone evicted for non-payment of heat because it is bundled in with their rent and service charges. Also, Ofgem do not want any back billing, catch-up bills of more than 12 months, which can be a shock and cause financial hardship. Ofgem at this early stage maybe do not understand enough about service charges, hence the need for the consultation and feedback from the sector. As a domestic customer, an energy supplier can only redress missed or inaccurate billing up to a period of 12 months. However, with the 18-month rule under the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985 for variable service charges, this doesn't align itself. Nor do fixed service charges, which do not appear to have even been considered, where there isn't even a reconciliation of actual cost and it is just an estimate. But this obviously goes against the whole point of the legislation, so how likely fixed service charges on heating will be allowed to continue is anyone's guess, the key being accuracy for customers. The purpose of this legislation is they want customers metering so they have full transparency on their own usage. And where in previous legislation supported and extra care schemes were exempt from the legislation, this will no longer be the case. Ofgem are proposing a timeframe of 5 years to transition to full metering, but the cost expectation on housing associations needs to be made a consideration, with a meter supply and fit costing approximately £1,000. A solution they are suggesting in this possible 5-year transition is to separate out heat charges onto a different charge bill with a 12-month rule, so they will no longer be part of service charges. Acknowledging this may require changes to legislation, or carry on with heating charges as part of service charges with no change, or a third option, which is a midway option, to keep heat charges within service charges but with clearer explanations around how they've been calculated. Possibly another area that hasn't been fully considered is eligibility rules for communal heating if heat charges are separated from service charges. Also, when there is a proposal of no back billing and working to a 12-month period, when invoices are received in arrears and need to be checked and authorised, how will this work? Also, with any new schemes, we need to ensure that these are metered. Regarding vulnerability, there is currently a really broad definition of vulnerability, and again further consultation around this will come, but as it stands, it is this: individuals who are deemed more at risk of detriment due to their personal circumstances or situation. A primary objective of the regulation is to adequately protect and support vulnerable customers via a vulnerability principle with specific obligations which are listed on the slide, but protections such as the need to proactively offer repayment plans, not to install prepayment meters or disconnect in winter, if there are people in the property under age 2 or over 75, disabled or terminally or chronically ill. Concern has been shared from the sector in response to the current consultation around landlords' obligations if a customer chooses to disconnect from the system. What obligations do we have as a landlord? Regarding the sustainability of the tenancy, if housing associations were to subsidise or offer energy vouchers, for example, how is this fair on those customers that are paying, and what is the incentive therefore to pay? Another question that maybe should be asked is there a requirement for more education around heat networks with customers? Some customers just refuse to pay and say they don't use it, and heat their homes using electric heaters and heat hot water in other ways, although they cannot argue with the provision of supply. Thank you for watching this presentation. As you can see, there is a lot to keep up with on heat network regulations, so please follow our regular updates and contact us if specific support is required.